Hi everybody, Karen Roby here with Scott Fulton of ZDNet. We're talking today about some machine learning algorithms that are available in the public cloud that many folks are saying show some characteristics of racism. And so, Scott, we're going to chat about this today. Obviously it's a sensitive topic for many reasons, certainly amplified by many of current events here going on. But just start, with what prompted this research.
Well, hi, Karen. What prompted the research, more than just the enormity of the current events that have been happening, is the fact that a lot of journalistic endeavors, and I credit the New York Times with this. I credit one of my other publications that I've contributed to, the New Stack, and also the CBS Interactive Network with ZDNet and Tech Republic. What we've been doing is managing to take a deeper and deeper look into the accuracy of machine learning. And what some heads of state have realized, especially, and what members of parliament have realized in the European Union, and what some university researchers have been bringing to light. This is part of what the New York Times story last January has revealed, is that there are certain behaviors in the results of machine learning algorithms, things that predict or make judgment calls about certain states of being, certain images, the credit worthiness of individuals in certain databases that reveal aspects of bias such that if a human being were to make those same judgments, that person might be fired. It shows aspects of out and out racism, sexism, homophobia. And we're talking about cases where these algorithms are making judgments about, a person's worthiness to be given credit, or that person's risk assessment for an insurance company, and even some of the folks who are the heads of the credit finance reporting agencies. In my story for ZDNet, I used Zest Finance as an example. They're actually out and out admitting that the algorithms that they've been using show some racist characteristics, or things that, when put on paper, the bias looks distinctively tinted, and I use that word tinted well, towards light-skinned people, even light-skinned male people. And that it's certainly unfair, but it raises the question, can we mathematically compensate for that? Can we take that bias out? Certainly, the whole point of machine learning is to recognize patterns. And racism, that's a pattern. So you would think that ML would be able to take a look at where results seem to tint away from a certain subcategory or people defined by a certain set of properties, and say, whoops, that's a pattern that maybe we can take out. And here's the thing, we can take it out, but in so doing, mathematically speaking, we may reduce the effectiveness of those same algorithms to make real-world predictions or real-world observations. It's like when you train an algorithm to recognize bananas, and you give it any type of a photograph, and it'll raise its hand and say yes when it sees bananas. But telling that same algorithm, okay, we're going to take away color from the inputs, and now you're going to look at only black and white photographs, only monochrome photographs, it's going to be less capable of recognizing bananas, even if you gave it only bananas as a test input. This is a fairly significant problem, and it's going to take more than just mathematics to be able to solve it, and that's what my story for ZDNet is about right now.
Yeah, it is a significant problem, Scott, and certainly unfair. And so I guess the question would be then at this point, what are the things that need to happen to compensate for this? What do we do about these types of algorithms?
Compensation is a difficult matter, and that gets to the chart I have behind me. Watch Scott without his charts. I've got 4 graphs here, each of which represents the relationships between 2 factors, 2 arbitrary factors in a machine learning database. They're plotted on an X and Y axis, and here I kind of have, I make arbitrary plots. But if you've ever operated the forecasting function in an Excel spreadsheet, you know what linear regression is, the capability to take a line and make that line best fit a graph that contains 2 factors in a chart. So that's what this training set here is in the upper left corner. What I've done is I've taken a scatter plot of 7 random elements and created a best fit line, which represents the function that best represents. It's the closest function to fitting each of those. So a forecast function would say, well, what would that plot point be if we were looking for something that's way over here? And because that arrow tips ever so slightly up, it will create a function that kind of matches that. And that's nice to have, but it's not very applicable in machine learning. Machine learning is very, very different in how you have to train it. If you're training it to recognize the lowercase letter A, for example, and you give it so many cases of letter A, it's developing its own formulas based on weights and measures that model, that mimic, if you will, a system of reasoning that was designed originally to estimate how neurons work in the human brain. So it's not exactly the same as linear regression whatsoever. So the way machine learning typically works is you train an algorithm on certain data, and then you test it with a new batch of data to see whether it knows what it's supposed to recognize. Now, with linear regression, if we were to take a completely different set of data, which is what this thing on the lower left represents, and test it against the function that the linear regression system will have learned, the difference between what that function actually points to in the test data and what the function points to that it has learned is bias. This is the extent to which the function is wrong. So bias, mathematically speaking, is the difference between the answer we expect, which in this chart would be on the top, and the answer we get, which is the arrow that's falling below it. And when we get an answer from something that's evaluating whether a person is worthy to be given a loan based on his history, based on his upbringing, based on his class, if we and don't think they don't put class in databases, and based on his skin color, then the difference that we expect, the answers that we expect may be different than those we get. And that's bias. That's where cognitive bias, our ability to make things wrong, translates into computational bias, the machine's capability to get things wrong. Your question is, how do we compensate for it? Well, what machine learning tries to do is make a function that best fits the training data, which is what we have in the upper right here. We have a squiggly line function that goes through all of the data points pretty well. So that there's really no bias up here in the function that it is learned. This strange squiggly line function will definitely give you this answer, assuming it ever gets input data that looks exactly like this. So what we've done in order to make it fit is give the function a very high degree of variance. The problem with giving functions a high degree of variance is we increase their rate of error. And this is that's exemplified by the graph in the lower right. When we give that same test data back to it, the difference between the function it predicts and the function we expect is extremely wrong. So this demonstrates that when we try to attack the problem of eliminating bias in functions, we increase the probability that the functions are almost totally useless. And if you've ever wondered where do we see an example of that in the real world, would be the 2016 presidential election, where in certain counties, in certain states, the opinion polls that were taken prior to the election, Hillary Clinton was projected to win very handily in those counties, when the results in some of those counties were 20, 30 points the other direction. They were completely wrong. And some of those polling methods are still being reevaluated to this day.
And Scott, that's definitely, the example with Hillary Clinton there, a good example that people, that we all remember from that election. But you think about technology really, and you think it should be a safe place, away from all of these topics that we're embarrassed of or embarrassed to talk about, but it's really not.
Yeah, a couple of decades ago, I recall working with a group of people who were working on a publication where the editor in charge looked at several of us that were on the conference call and said, you boys have it easy. You boys, and that's what he called us, including some of the girls, you boys. You know who you are. You boys have it easy. You're talking about all the safe stuff. And there is a little bit of a bias right there. Folks have a tendency to think that the technology section of what we used to call the newspaper is the safe section, the part that talks about how, one day Google adds roundness to the rectangles in its Android functions, and a few months later, Google takes away the roundness and replaces them with rectangles. We can sometimes have some very, very safe topics to talk about. But in this day and age, nothing is safe. Everything is forcing us to a realization that our society is in need of, and in fact, undergoing, whether we want to or not, systemic change. It's forcing us to talk about things that are sensitive, uncomfortable, and they fall under the category of things politicians tell us we ought to have a conversation about. Usually that's a euphemism for things we stick on the back shelf, and we'll talk about it later when we have a back page moment, when we have 5 minutes. But no, it's time for some front page things, because more and more artificial intelligence is advising human decision. So we need to treat AI much more in an advisory capacity. We need to reevaluate its worthiness to be an assistant advisor, if you will. And we need to be capable, if it comes to this, of disqualifying it, of saying this methodology is not worth using, because in our hearts and minds, we know better, at least until the methodology and the machine learning algorithms have changed somewhat. Now, there is some progress in that direction. And my story points to some research that has been done by Penn State University and Purdue University researchers into the methodologies by which AI functions come and the result. And what they're discovering is there are ways that you can take input data and go ahead and evaluate that input data for all the characteristics, including skin tone, including gender, whether or not the gender is binary. And we know now that probably should be a floating point function rather than a binary function. But we take the data that we have and we make the evaluations that we make. and then make a second set where we don't take those systemic, sensitive calculations into effect, where we see the world a little more colorblind. This is something that where my daughter would warn me, and she'd say, no, folks who say that they're colorblind with respect to race are invoking a racist concept. And that may very well be true. But if we take these two measures, one that's kind of a black box measure in the world that we have that our data is already representing, and this white box measure of the world we think we want to see, and we measure like this the differences between the two, we can come up with something that we can use as a margin of error. Something that say, you know, if we weren't taking gender into account, if we weren't taking race into account, the results would be this much different. Maybe it's 15 points. Maybe in certain cases, like the MIT Toronto study, it's 30 points or more in some of the data that Amazon and Azure have been using. And if it is that much, then maybe we should throw it out.
Yeah, definitely something to think about there. And you're right, we are being pushed or forced to talk about these things, and that's good. It's a good thing. So, Scott, we certainly appreciate your insight on this and the graph that you put together there for us to help us understand. And Scott's full article can be found on ZDNet.